Thanos Rossi did not get to the top of the Chicago syndicate by trusting the people around him. At 34, he was a phantom in the underworld, a man who controlled the shipping ports, the underground casinos, and a vast network of politicians with nothing more than a quiet word and a heavy stare. His world was one of calculated risks, tailored Brioni suits, and absolute loyalty. But inside his sprawling, $40 million penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, Thanos was entirely out of his element. He was a single father to 4-year-old twins, Leo and Mia. Their mother, a woman Thanos had loved with a fierce, quiet intensity, had died in childbirth, leaving a hollow cavity in his chest that all the power in the world couldn't fill. Now, 4 years later, society and his family's board of capos demanded he take a wife, a mother for his heirs, a queen for the Rossi Empire. Enter Serafina Sterling. Serafina was the daughter of a corrupt state senator, a woman bred for high society. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with spun gold hair and eyes like chipped ice. On paper, the alliance was perfect. It merged old political money with Thanos' raw, unregulated power. But as the wedding date loomed, a cold knot of dread began to tighten in Thanos' gut. Serafina played the part of the doting fiancé for the cameras and the society pages. She bought the twins extravagant, uncomfortable designer clothes. She planned a wedding at the Drake Hotel that was set to cost more than the GDP of a small island nation. But in the quiet moments, when the cameras were off and the guests were gone, Thanos saw the cracks in the veneer. He noticed how she flinched when Leo accidentally spilled juice on her silk dress. He saw the cold, vacant look in her eyes when Mia cried from a nightmare. Serafina didn't want a family. She wanted a crown. Worse still, Thanos' right-hand man, Alessandro, had intercepted whispered rumors on Rush Street. The Calabresi family, Thanos' oldest and bloodiest rivals, were suddenly flush with cash, and there were whispers of an inside informant leaking Rossi shipping routes. Serafina's father had deep ties to the Calabreses. It was a paranoid thought. But in Thanos' world, paranoia was a survival instinct. Amidst this swirling storm of doubt, there was Minna. Minna Jenkins was 22, a nursing student drowning in debt, working as a maid in the Rossi household to keep her mother on life support at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. She was invisible to Serafina, treated as little more than a piece of furniture that occasionally held a feather duster. But to the twins, Minna was the sun. Thanos watched from his home office as Minna interacted with his children. He watched her abandon her cleaning duties to sit on the floor and build elaborate Lego castles with Leo. He listened to her sing soft, off-key lullabies to Mia when the little girl was afraid of the thunderstorms rolling in off the lake. Minna was exhausted, her uniform often slightly wrinkled, dark circles bruised beneath her warm, hazel eyes. Yet, she possessed a well of genuine, uncorrupted kindness that Thanos had never encountered in his brutal life. One evening, a week before the wedding, Thanos made his decision. He couldn't marry Serafina without knowing the truth. He couldn't hand his children and his empire over to a viper. He needed to strip away the money, the power, and the fear to see what was left beneath. "Alessandro," Thanos said, pouring 2 glasses of scotch in his dimly lit study. "Call the fixer. We're setting up a theater production. I need an accident, something catastrophic, and I need to be entirely broken." Alessandro, a man with a scarred face and cold eyes, paused, the crystal glass halfway to his lips. "You want to fake your own demise, boss?" "Not my demise," Thanos corrected, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "My destruction. I want to see who stays when the crown falls into the mud." The setup was a masterpiece of underworld engineering. It had to happen in front of Serafina, and tragically, the twins were in the trailing SUV with their nanny, making them an unintended but crucial audience to the lie. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Thanos had insisted on driving Serafina to a high-profile fitting at a boutique on Oak Street in his vintage Aston Martin, while the security detail and the children followed closely behind. The rain was slick and heavy, the kind that turned Chicago's streets into black mirrors. As they approached a controlled intersection near Lakeshore Drive, Thanos gave the signal. 2 taps on the brakes. A heavy, reinforced garbage truck, driven by one of Alessandro's most trusted men, blew through the red light. The timing was impeccable. The truck clipped the front end of the Aston Martin, sending the sports car into a violent, controlled spin. Glass shattered like diamond dust in the air. The sound of crunching metal echoed like a bomb blast. Thanos, wearing a custom-fitted kinetic vest beneath his suit, took the brunt of the impact safely. But he bit down on a capsule of stage blood, letting the crimson liquid spill from his mouth and down his ruined white shirt. The car slammed into a concrete barrier and ground to a halt. Smoke hissed from the crumpled hood. In the passenger seat, Serafina shrieked, her airbag deploying. She was perfectly safe, completely unharmed, but her panic was instantaneous and entirely self-centered. "My face! My dress!" she screamed, clawing at the deflated airbag. Thanos slumped over the steering wheel, his eyes half closed, perfectly playing the part of a man hovering on the edge of death. "Sarah!" he choked out, coughing up the fake blood. "The kids. Get the kids." Serafina kicked her door open, stumbling out into the rain. Did she reach for him? Did she check his pulse? No. She looked at his bleeding, motionless body with a mixture of horror and profound disgust. "Help me!" she screamed to the gathering crowd, entirely ignoring the man she was supposed to marry in 6 days. The trailing SUV screeched to a halt. The security guards leaped out, playing their parts perfectly, yelling for an ambulance. But it was the rear door of the SUV that caught Thanos's fading, slitted gaze. Minna, who had accompanied the twins that day to help with their outfits, burst from the vehicle. She didn't hesitate. She didn't scream about her clothes or the rain. While Serafina was busy checking her reflection in a shattered storefront window, Minna sprinted toward the smoking wreckage of the Aston Martin. "Mr. Rossi!" Minna cried, her voice cracking with raw terror. She shoved past a security guard and threw herself through the shattered driver's side window. Thanos felt her small, trembling hands against his neck, frantically searching for a pulse. Her face was pale, soaked with rain and tears. She didn't care about the blood ruining her clothes. She didn't care about the danger of the smoking engine. "I've got you," Minna whispered fiercely, her medical training kicking in. She stripped off her own coat and pressed it against his supposedly bleeding chest. "Stay with me, Thanos. Please, the kids need you. Leo and Mia need you." It was the first time she had ever used his first name. Hearing it from her lips, laced with such raw, uncalculated desperation, sent a shock wave through Thanos's chest that had nothing to do with the crash. He let his eyes flutter shut, feigning unconsciousness, but his mind was racing. Serafina had abandoned him in seconds. The poor maid had thrown herself into the wreckage to save him. The paramedics, who were secretly on the Rossi payroll, arrived with sirens blaring. They pulled Thanos from the car, loading him onto a stretcher. As they rolled him away, Thanos cracked his eyes open just a fraction. He saw Serafina shivering under an umbrella held by a bodyguard, already typing furiously on her phone. And then he saw Minna. She was kneeling on the wet asphalt, her hands covered in his fake blood, holding Leo and Mia tightly against her chest, shielding their eyes from the wreckage, rocking them and promising them that everything was going to be okay. The trap had been sprung. Now, the real torture would begin. The official story released to the press was grim. Thanos Rossi had survived the crash, but suffered catastrophic spinal cord injuries and severe brain trauma. He was transported back to his heavily guarded Winnetka estate, confined to a high-tech medical bed, supposedly paralyzed from the neck down and locked in a non-responsive, vegetative state. In reality, the medical equipment was rigged. The heart monitors and brainwave machines played pre-recorded loops. When the room was empty, Thanos would stretch his legs, review financial reports on a hidden tablet, and listen to the audio feeds planted in every room of the mansion. The transformation in the house was immediate and chilling. Within 48 hours of Thanos being brought home, the mourning fiancé act was dropped. Serafina moved her belongings into the master wing, avoiding Thanos's medical suite like it was infected with the plague. The wedding was officially postponed, but Serafina began throwing her weight around the estate, acting as the de facto head of the household. Through his hidden earpiece, Thanos listened as she berated the staff, slashed the household budget, and, most sickeningly, banished the twins to the furthest wing of the house. "Keep those brats out of my sight," Thanos heard Serafina snap at her nanny on day 4. "Their crying gives me a migraine. And stop buying them those expensive organic meals. We need to conserve assets now that the golden goose is a vegetable." Thanos's hands curled into fists beneath his blankets, his nails digging into his palms until they bled. He wanted to rise from the bed, walk down the hall, and throw her out of the nearest window. But Alessandro urged patience. They needed hard evidence of her betrayal with the Calabreses. While Serafina revealed her monstrous true nature, another story was unfolding in the shadows of the mansion. Minna had been strictly ordered by Serafina to stay away from the medical wing. "You're a cleaner, not a nurse," Serafina had spat at her. But Minna couldn't stay away. Every night, after midnight, when the private nurses, Rossi men in scrubs, went on break, and Serafina was dead to the world after drinking herself to sleep, the heavy oak door to Thanos's room would silently click open. Minna would slip inside. Thanos lay perfectly still, his breathing slow and measured, as Minna approached the bed. He felt the soft, warm dampness of a washcloth as she gently wiped the sweat from his brow. "I know you probably can't hear me, Mr. Rossi," Minna whispered into the quiet hum of the machines, her voice trembling slightly. "But I wanted to tell you about the twins today. Leo drew a picture of a dragon. He says it's you, protecting the castle. And Mia lost her first tooth. I put it under her pillow because, well, someone had to." Thanos felt a sudden, sharp ache in his throat. This girl, who was drowning in her own life's tragedies, who was treated like dirt by the woman who was supposed to be the lady of the house, was sneaking in to ensure a comatose Mafia boss knew his children still loved him. Days turned into a week. Minna's midnight visits became Thanos's lifeline. She would read to him, poetry, nursing textbooks, whatever she had. She would massage his supposedly atrophied muscles to prevent bed sores, her touch strictly professional, but undeniably tender. "You have to wake up, Thanos," she cried softly one night, her tears splashing hot against his forearm. They're circling. "Serafina, she's awful to them. She's awful to everyone." I heard her on the phone today. She was talking to someone named Carmine. She told him that the shipping manifests are in your safe, and she's trying to crack the code. Beneath his placid exterior, Thanos's mind exploded. Carmine Calabrese, the head of the rival family. Serafina wasn't just a gold digger. She was a rat. She was trying to hand his empire over to the men who had slaughtered his father 20 years ago. Thanos desperately wanted to open his eyes, to grab Minna's hand, to tell her she was safe, and that he was going to burn Seraphina's world to ash. But he couldn't break cover yet. He needed the proof. He needed Seraphina to open that safe. "I won't let her hurt Leo and Mia," Minna whispered fiercely, squeezing his lifeless hand. "I promise you, even if she fires me, even if I have to steal them away in the night, I will protect them, I swear it." Thanos felt a tear slip from the corner of his closed eye, soaking into his pillow. He had spent his entire life looking for loyalty in the blood-soaked streets of Chicago, surrounded by hardened killers and oath-takers. Yet, the purest loyalty he had ever found was standing right here, dressed in a cheap cotton uniform. The next afternoon, the climax of Thanos' trap began to unfold. Alessandro's voice crackled through the hidden earpiece. "Boss, she's making her move. Seraphina just dismissed the day staff. She's bringing Carmine's right-hand man into the house. They're going for the safe in your study." Thanos slowly opened his eyes, the emerald-green irises cold, sharp, and deadly. He threw off the heavy medical blankets and swung his legs over the side of the bed. His bare feet hit the cold hardwood floor. He hadn't stood up in 2 weeks, but his body was coiled like a spring. "Let them get the safe open, Alessandro," Thanos whispered into the microphone hidden in his watch. "Have the boys surround the perimeter. No one gets out." Thanos walked to his private closet and pulled out a tailored, charcoal-grey suit. He strapped his custom shoulder holster over his crisp white shirt and slid his Beretta 9mm into place. As he tied his silk tie, he looked at his reflection in the mirror. The vegetable was gone. The boss of the Chicago Syndicate was back, but just as Thanos reached for the door handle to make his grand, terrifying entrance, a scream ripped through the silence of the mansion. It wasn't Seraphina. It was Minna. The sound of Minna's scream tore through the sprawling Winnetka estate, shattering the manufactured silence of Thanos Rossi's convalescence. It wasn't a scream of surprise. It was a guttural, terrifying sound of sheer desperation. Thanos didn't hesitate. The facade of the paralyzed, broken man vanished instantly, replaced by the apex predator who had built a criminal empire over the bones of his enemies. He sprinted down the long, Persian-carpeted hallway, his bare feet making no sound, his 9mm Beretta gripped loosely but lethally in his right hand. The scream had come from his private study, the West Wing, a strictly off-limits sanctuary of dark mahogany, leather-bound ledgers, and a hidden wall safe concealed behind a genuine, multi-million-dollar Caravaggio painting. As Thanos neared the heavy, double-oak doors, he heard the sound of a scuffle, followed by the chillingly calm voice of Seraphina. "Just hit her with the butt of the gun, Silas," Seraphina hissed, her tone dripping with annoyance rather than panic. "She's ruining the timeline. Carmine said we only have an hour before the shift change." Thanos pressed his back against the wall, peering through the crack between the double doors. Inside, the study was in disarray. The Caravaggio had been swung open, revealing the titanium face of the safe. Standing in front of it was Silas Vane, a notorious enforcer and safe-cracker for the Calabrese family. But it wasn't Silas that made Thanos' blood boil over. It was Minna. The young maid was on her knees, her neat uniform torn at the shoulder. A thin line of blood trickled down her pale cheek where she had clearly been struck. But she wasn't cowering. She had positioned herself between Silas and the door leading to the children's wing. In her trembling hands, she clutched a heavy, brass fireplace poker, pointing it fiercely at the armed hitman. "You are not going near that wing," Minna gasped, her chest heaving. "The children are asleep. If you take one step toward that door, I swear to God I will take your eye out." Silas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. He raised his suppressed pistol, aiming it directly at Minna's chest. "Spirited little housekeeper, aren't you? Shame? Do it, Silas," Serafina snapped. She was standing by Thanos's desk, hastily shoving stacks of sensitive shipping manifests. Documents that detailed every smuggled shipment coming through the port of Chicago into a Prada leather tote bag. "If she talks, my father's campaign is ruined. Dispose of her in the lake." Thanos had heard enough. He didn't kick the door open. He simply glided into the room like a shadow detached from the wall. "I wouldn't recommend that, Silas," Thanos said. His voice was quiet, eerily calm, yet it carried the heavy, suffocating weight of an executioner's gavel. The temperature in the room plummeted. Silas froze. Serafina dropped the Prada bag, the leather hitting the floor with a heavy, sickening thud. Both of them turned slowly, their eyes widening in absolute, paralyzing horror. Standing before them was the man they believed was a vegetative husk. Thanos Rossi was dressed in a pristine, charcoal-grey suit, standing tall, his broad shoulders blocking the exit. There were no IV tubes, no wheelchair, no glazed, empty eyes. The emerald green of his gaze was razor-sharp, burning with a quiet, lethal fury. "Thanos!" Serafina whispered, the color draining completely from her flawless face. She stumbled backward, her high heel catching on the edge of a rug. "But the doctors! Your spine!" Silas, however, was a professional killer. He didn't waste time on shock. His survival instincts kicked in, and he swung his suppressed pistol away from Minna and toward Thanos. He was far too slow. Before Silas could even fully align the barrel, Thanos raised his Beretta and fired a single, deafening shot. The bullet shattered Silas's kneecap. The hitman screamed, dropping his weapon as his leg buckled beneath him. He crashed to the floor, writhing in agony, clutching his shattered joint as dark blood began to pool on the antique rug. Thanos didn't even blink. He kept his gun leveled, his eyes shifting from the bleeding man on the floor to the trembling woman by the desk. "My spine is in excellent condition, Serafina," Thanos said, taking a slow, measured step into the room. "My patience, however, is severely fractured." The silence that followed the gunshot was absolute, save for the wet, ragged groans of Silas Vane bleeding out on the floor. Minna had dropped the brass poker, her hands flying to her mouth. She stared at Thanos, her hazel eyes wide with a mixture of profound relief and utter terror. The vulnerable, broken man she had bathed, read to, and cried over for 2 weeks was gone. In his place stood the myth she had only heard whispers of in the servants' quarters, the ruthless Don of the Chicago Syndicate. Thanos didn't look at Minna yet. He couldn't afford to let his mask slip. All his focus was pinned on his fiancée. "Dom, darling, please," Serafina stammered, her voice pitching up an octave into a hysterical squeak. She held her hands up, palms out, taking another step back until she hit the edge of the mahogany desk. "This isn't what it looks like. Silas! He broke in. He forced me to open the safe. I was trying to protect your assets." Thanos let out a low, dark laugh that lacked any trace of humor. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a small, sleek remote control. He pressed a button. Instantly, the hidden surround sound speakers in the study crackled to life. "Keep those brats out of my sight. Their crying gives me a migraine. And stop buying them those expensive organic meals. We need to conserve assets now that the golden goose is a vegetable." Serafina's own voice echoed through the room, crisp and damning. She gasped, her hands flying to her ears as if she could physically block the sound. Thanos pressed the button again. "Carmine, it's Serafina. I'm in. He's brain dead. The doctors say he won't wake up. I have the keys to the kingdom. I just need Silas to crack the titanium box in his study. The port manifests are ours." Thanos clicked the remote off, tossing it onto a nearby leather armchair. "You always were a terrible liar, Sarah. Your father, Senator Sterling, at least has the decency to look me in the eye when he tries to rob me. You just wait until you think I'm dead." "You set me up!" Seraphina screamed, her fear suddenly mutating into venomous rage. Her pristine mask shattered entirely, revealing the ugly, desperate creature beneath. "That crash! The doctors! It was all a test! You psychotic monster!" "A test you failed spectacularly," Thanos replied, stepping closer to her. He loomed over her, radiating authority and violence. "I gave you my home. I offered you my name. I trusted you with my children. And you sold me to the Calabrases for a slightly larger slice of a pie you already owned." He reached out, his hand moving so fast Seraphina couldn't flinch away. He grabbed her left hand, firmly grasping her ring finger. With a sharp, merciless tug, he pulled the $2 million, flawless-cut diamond engagement ring off her finger. Seraphina whimpered as the metal scraped her knuckle. "This belongs to a Rossi," Thanos said, slipping the cold diamond into his trouser pocket. "And you are nothing but a common thief." Right on cue, the heavy double doors swung wide open. Alessandro strode in, flanked by 4 heavily armed Rossi enforcers. They took one look at the scene, Silas bleeding on the floor, Seraphina trembling, Thanos standing tall, and immediately went to work. "Alessandro," Thanos commanded without looking back, "take Mr. Vane to the warehouse on the south side. Call a doctor to stabilize his knee. I want him alive to send a message to Carmine." 2 enforcers hoisted the screaming Silas by his armpits and dragged him out of the room, leaving a trail of crimson across the marble hallway. "And her?" Alessandro asked, looking at Seraphina with undisguised disgust. "Take her phone. Strip her of any Rossi-funded credit cards, jewelry, and access keys," Thanos ordered coldly. "Escort her to the front gates. If she sets foot on my property again, or if her father attempts to contact the Calabrases, leak the audio files of her conspiring to commit corporate espionage to the FBI. The senator will be in federal prison by Tuesday." "No, Thanos, please!" Seraphina sobbed, falling to her knees on the ruined carpet. The Ice Queen had completely melted. "I have nowhere to go. My father will kill me. You can't just throw me out into the rain." "I can," Thanos said softly, looking down at her. "Because, unlike you, I take out the trash." He turned his back on her. "Get her out of my sight." Alessandro and a guard grabbed Seraphina by the arms, dragging her out of the study. Her hysterical screams and apologies echoed down the hallway, growing fainter and fainter until the heavy front doors slammed shut, cutting her off completely. The storm had passed. The traitors were gone. Silence descended on the study once more, thick and heavy. Thanos slowly lowered his gun, engaging the safety before placing it on the desk. He took a deep breath, letting the tension bleed out of his shoulders. The Mafia boss faded back into the shadows, leaving behind a man who was acutely aware of the devastation he had just orchestrated in his own home. He turned around. Minna was still kneeling by the doorway. She had pressed herself against the wall, her knees pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around her shins. She was shaking violently, her eyes darting between the puddle of blood on the floor and Thanos' face. She had just watched a man get shot. She had just seen the brutal, uncompromising reality of Thanos' world, the very world she had promised to protect his children from. Thanos felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt in his chest. He walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate, raising his hands to show they were empty. "Minna," he said, his voice dropping to that soft, gentle rumble he reserved only for Leo and Mia. She flinched violently as he spoke, pressing herself harder against the wall, tears spilling over her eyelashes. "Please," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Please don't hurt me. I didn't see anything. I won't tell anyone. Just let me go check on the twins." Thanos's heart cracked. He knelt down in front of her, ignoring the expensive fabric of his suit pants, soaking up the spilled blood on the rug. "I'm not going to hurt you, Mina," he said softly, looking directly into her terrified hazel eyes. "I'm never going to hurt you. You saved my life. And tonight, you stood in front of a loaded gun to protect my children." He reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before gently resting his hand on her uninjured shoulder. "The act is over. You're safe now." The sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder hung heavy in the air of the study, violently masking the usual sense of aged mahogany and expensive scotch. Minna remained pressed against the wall, her knees pulled tightly to her chest, her breathing shallow and frantic. Her hazel eyes were wide, locked on the dark puddle of blood, sinking into the priceless Persian rug where Silas Vane had fallen just moments before. She had grown up in the rougher neighborhoods of Chicago. She wasn't entirely naive to the darkness of the world, but witnessing the absolute, surgical violence of Thanos Rossi firsthand was a visceral shock that rattled her to her core. Thanos stood over the desk for a moment, his broad back to her. The ruthless don of the Chicago syndicate took a slow, deep breath, visibly forcing the lethal tension out of his heavily muscled shoulders. When he finally turned to face her, the cold, reptilian gaze that had condemned Serafina to the streets was completely gone. In its place was a profound, aching vulnerability, a raw openness he had never shown to another living soul. He didn't stride toward her with the arrogance of a mob boss. He approached her slowly, deliberately, raising his empty hands to show he was unarmed, his steps practically silent on the hardwood floor. "Minna," he murmured, his voice dropping to that soft, gravelly timbre he usually reserved only for soothing Leo and Mia after a nightmare. Minna flinched instinctively, pressing herself harder against the wall, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her eyelashes. "Please," she stammered, her voice barely a cracked whisper. "I didn't see anything, Mr. Rossi. I swear. I'll just go. I need to go check on the twins. Please, just let me." Thanos's heart seized. The fear in her eyes was a knife twisting in his chest. He ignored the ruin of his custom-tailored trousers and knelt directly in the pooling blood on the floor, bringing himself down to her eye level. "I'm never going to hurt you, Minna," Thanos said, his voice fierce but incredibly gentle. He kept his hands in his lap, giving her space. "Look at me. Please." Slowly, Minna dragged her gaze from the floor to meet his striking green eyes. "You snuck into a dead man's room every single night," Thanos said, the words heavy with an emotion he hadn't let himself feel in 4 years. "You held my hand when you thought I couldn't feel it. You read to me. You promised a ghost that you would protect his children from the monster living in his house. Why?" Minna swallowed hard, the adrenaline slowly beginning to ebb, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. "Because they didn't have anyone else," she whispered, her hands trembling as she wiped a tear from her jaw. "And because, beneath all this money, and the rumors, and the terrifying men in suits, I saw how you looked at your kids before the accident. You're a good father, Thanos. They deserved to keep you." In Thanos's world, loyalty was a commodity bought with blood, fear, or gold. Serafina had demanded millions and still sold him out, but this 22-year-old girl, drowning in her own tragic life, had offered her fierce, unyielding loyalty for absolutely nothing in return. She had stood in front of a loaded gun with a brass fireplace poker to protect children that weren't even hers. Thanos stood up slowly and offered her his hand. Minna hesitated for only a fraction of a second before placing her small, shaking fingers into his large palm. He pulled her up effortlessly, his grip warm and grounding. "Alessandro," Thanos called out into the hallway. The scarred enforcer appeared instantly at the door. He took one look at Minna, noting the torn shoulder of her uniform and the thin scratch on her pale cheek where Silas had struck her. For the first time, Alessandro didn't look at her like a piece of the hired help. He dipped his chin in a deep, respectful nod. "Boss? Seal this room. Have a clean-up crew handle the mess," Thanos ordered, wrapping a protective arm around Minna's shoulders and guiding her toward the door. "Bring the first aid kit to my private quarters, and bring me my encrypted satellite phone." 10 minutes later, the chaotic violence of the study felt a million miles away. Minna was sitting on the edge of a plush, oversized leather sofa in Thanos's private sanctuary, a room she had never been allowed to enter before. The lighting was low and warm. Thanos sat on the coffee table directly across from her. He had discarded his suit jacket and rolled up his crisp white sleeves, exposing the dark ink of syndicate tattoos winding up his forearms. He held a small antiseptic wipe, gently dabbing at the scratch on Minna's cheek. The reversal of their roles wasn't lost on either of them. For 2 weeks, she had bathed him and tended to his staged wounds. Now, the untouchable crime boss was playing nursemaid to a cleaner. "Hold still," Thanos murmured, carefully applying a small butterfly bandage to her skin. His knuckles brushed against her jawline, sending a surprising jolt of electricity through Minna's exhausted system. Before she could thank him, Alessandro stepped into the room, handing Thanos a heavy, black satellite phone. Thanos took it, his demeanor instantly shifting back to the commanding force that ran the city's underworld. "Drink your water," Thanos instructed Minna softly, before turning his attention to the device. He dialed a sequence of numbers from memory and put the phone to his ear. "Yes, this is Thanos Rossi," he said, his tone authoritative, slicing through the quiet room. "I need to speak with Dr. Harrison Gallagher, Chief of Pulmonology at Northwestern Memorial. I don't care that it's 2 a.m, nurse. You have exactly 30 seconds to wake him up before I make a phone call to the hospital's board of directors and have your entire floor restructured." Minna's head snapped up so fast her neck popped. She nearly dropped her water glass. Northwestern Memorial. That was the hospital where her mother, Margaret Jenkins, was currently hooked up to a ventilator, drowning in a sea of medical debt that Minna could never hope to clear on a maid's salary. "Dr. Gallagher," Thanos said smoothly into the receiver a moment later. "I am calling regarding a patient in your care. Margaret Jenkins, room 412 in the ICU. I am having my wealth management team at Chase Bank wire $4 million to your department's private endowment fund at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." Thanos paused, his sharp green eyes locking onto Minna's terrified, disbelieving face. She had stopped breathing. "In exchange," Thanos continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that brooked absolutely no argument, "Mrs. Jenkins's outstanding balance is to be wiped clean by dawn. She is to be immediately moved to the VIP recovery suite on the top floor. You will personally oversee her care, and she will receive the experimental stem cell treatments you've been denying her insurance company. If her condition deteriorates because of administrative negligence, or if a single bill ever finds its way to her daughter's mailbox again, I will buy the hospital, fire you, and ensure you never practice medicine in the state of Illinois again. Are we entirely clear?" There was a faint, frantic voice on the other end of the line. "Excellent. Do your job, Doctor," Thanos said, cutting the call and tossing the heavy phone onto the sofa beside him. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes never leaving Minna. "Your mother's debt is gone, Minna. The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning. She's going to live." Minna gasped, clapping both hands over her mouth as a fresh, entirely different kind of sob ripped from her throat. The crushing, suffocating weight she had carried on her shoulders for the last 2 years, the later notices, the threatening calls from collection agencies, the absolute terror of losing the only family she had left, evaporated in an instant. You didn't have to do that," Minna wept, her entire body shaking with the force of her relief. She slid off the sofa, her knees hitting the plush carpet as she looked up at him. "I can never repay you." "Millions of dollars. I don't have that kind of money, Thanos. "Minna, stop," Thanos said, immediately dropping to his knees on the floor in front of her. He reached out, framing her tear-soaked face with his large, warm hands. "I don't want your money. I don't want your debt. Do you understand what you did tonight? You stood between my children and a man who kills for a living." He pulled her forward, wrapping his arms around her tightly. Minna collapsed against his chest, burying her face in the expensive cotton of his shirt, finally letting out the weeks of terror, exhaustion, and grief. Thanos held her securely, burying his face in her dark hair, breathing in the scent of cheap vanilla soap that had become his absolute lifeline over the past fortnight. "You already paid me back, Minna," he whispered fiercely into her hair. "You gave me back my life. You gave me back my children. This is just balancing the scales." Just then, the heavy oak door to the suite creaked open, the sound breaking the quiet intimacy of the room. 2 little figures, dressed in matching fleece dinosaur pajamas, stood in the doorway, rubbing their sleepy eyes in the dim light. "Daddy?" Leo mumbled, clutching a worn-out stuffed bear by its ear. Mia was standing right behind him, hiding halfway behind her brother, her thumb in her mouth. Thanos froze. The twins hadn't seen him standing, speaking, or even moving in over 2 weeks. He gently pulled away from Minna, his eyes wide, and turned toward the door. He opened his arms wide, tears finally breaking through his iron control, tracking down his rough cheeks. "Come here, my little monkeys," Thanos choked out, his voice cracking violently. The twins stared for a heartbeat, processing the miracle before them. Then they shrieked with pure, unadulterated joy. They sprinted across the thick carpet and launched themselves into Thanos's waiting arms. He caught them effortlessly, pulling them tightly against his chest, burying his face in their little necks. He rocked them back and forth, kissing their heads, holding them so tightly it looked as though he were physically anchoring himself to the earth. Minna watched from her spot on the floor, wiping the happy tears from her cheeks, a quiet, beautiful smile spreading across her face. Thanos looked up over Leo's small shoulder, his green eyes meeting Minna's hazel ones. The ruthless, untouchable Don of Chicago was gone. In that room, he was just a man who had finally found his home. And as he looked at the brave, beautiful woman sitting on his floor, he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was looking at the woman who was meant to rule it by his side. 6 months later, the unforgiving, razor-sharp winds sweeping off Lake Michigan heralded the arrival of a bitter Chicago winter. The city was encased in a shell of gray ice and gray skies, but inside the heavily fortified walls of the sprawling Rossi estate, the atmosphere had undergone a miraculous thaw. The fallout from Thanos's meticulously orchestrated deception had been swift, brutal, and absolute. Serafina's father, State Senator Arthur Sterling, had been arrested at a high society charity gala. An anonymous encrypted flash drive detailing his decades of embezzlement and his direct ties to organized crime had magically found its way to the desks of 3 separate federal prosecutors and the managing editor of the Chicago Tribune. Arthur was currently awaiting trial in a federal holding facility, denied bail. Without their political shield and reeling from the loss of their top enforcer, Silas Vane, the Calabrese family had panicked. Carmine Calabrese was forced to retreat deep into the shadows, abandoning his territory on the south side and ceding total control of the shipping ports back to the Rossi Syndicate. Thanos' empire was now entirely uncontested, but the most profound transformation had nothing to do with territory or politicians. It was Minna. Minna Jenkins was no longer the invisible girl in the wrinkled cotton uniform. She had moved her meager belongings out of the cramped, drafty servants' quarters and into the sprawling, sunlit master wing. Her mother, Margaret, had made a stunning recovery following the experimental surgeries Thanos had funded. Margaret now lived in a beautiful, secure condominium overlooking Millennium Park, attended to by top-tier private nurses. Yet, despite her sudden elevation into unimaginable wealth, Minna had not become another Serafina. She refused to wear the gaudy $2 million diamonds that society wives flaunted like armor. She didn't scream at the household staff. Instead, she knew all their names, asked about their families, and quietly ensured their wages were doubled. More surprisingly, Minna had taken a seat at the table. She occasionally sat in on Thanos' legitimate boardroom meetings concerning the shipping and real estate fronts. Dressed in elegant, understated tailored wool, she was a quiet, highly intelligent force who read the room with the same terrifying, laser-focused accuracy that Thanos possessed. She commanded the absolute, unquestioning respect of every hardened killer and capo in the Rossi Syndicate. They didn't bow to her because they feared the boss's wrath. They bowed to her because they knew this was the woman who had picked up a brass poker and stood in front of a loaded gun for the family. It was a freezing Tuesday afternoon when the ghost of the past made one final, desperate appearance. Minna was leaving an exclusive, appointment-only children's boutique on Oak Street. She held Leo and Mia by their hands, both twins bundled up in the thick, down-filled winter coats they had just excitedly picked out. Alessandro walked a step behind her right shoulder, his sharp eyes scanning the street, while 2 plain-clothed security guards flanked the perimeter. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor and impending snow. Suddenly, a gaunt, disheveled figure stepped out from the narrow alleyway beside the boutique, blocking the shoveled sidewalk. It was Serafina Sterling. The spun gold hair that had once taken hours to perfectly style was now stringy, dark at the roots, and matted against her pale cheeks. The imported silk dresses had been replaced by a stained, oversized trench coat that looked as though it had been pulled from a donation bin. The haughty, untouchable Ice Queen had been utterly decimated. When the Rossi Syndicate's funds had dried up and the federal government had frozen all of the Sterling family's assets, high society had slammed its heavy gilded doors firmly in her face. Alessandro moved with terrifying speed. He stepped immediately in front of Minna, his heavy winter coat sweeping back as his hand slipped inside to grip the handle of his holstered weapon. "Wait," Minna said softly, her voice steady and calm. She gently pushed the twins behind her, handing their small hands to the nanny who had been trailing them. "Take them to the armored car, please. Turn on the heat." Minna stepped forward, the collar of her tailored cashmere coat warding off the biting chill. Her posture was impeccably straight, her chin held high. She looked at the woman who had once treated her like a piece of defective furniture. "Minna!" Serafina croaked, her voice a raspy, desperate whine. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot and frantic. She rubbed her bare, freezing hands together. "Please, you have to tell him to call off the bank. They're foreclosing on the last apartment I have left. I have absolutely nothing. Just give me $100,000. It's pocket change to him. You know what it's like to be poor, Minna. You know what it's like to starve." Minna stood perfectly still, her expression entirely unreadable. She didn't feel a rush of triumphant vindication. She didn't feel the burning heat of anger. Staring at the ruined woman shivering on the pavement, Minna only felt a profound, chilling pity. "I do know what it's like to be poor, Serafina," Minna said quietly, her voice carrying easily over the whistling wind. "I know exactly what it's like to scrub floors until your hands bleed, just to keep your mother breathing on a ventilator. I know what it's like to be entirely invisible to the world." Minna took a deliberate step closer, her gaze hardening into something resembling crushed steel. Her voice dropped to a low, intimate whisper that only Serafina could hear. "But you didn't lose everything because you ran out of money. You lost everything because you ran out of humanity. You left the man you were supposed to marry to die in a burning car so you could check your reflection in a window. You would have let a hitman shoot me in that study just to cover your tracks." "I was scared," Serafina sobbed loudly, taking a desperate step forward, reaching out with a trembling hand to grab Minna's sleeve. Alessandro intervened instantly, his massive hand shooting out to shove Serafina back violently by the shoulder. "Do not touch her," the enforcer snarled, his eyes promising absolute violence. Minna calmly reached into her designer leather purse. She didn't pull out a checkbook. Instead, she extracted a single, crisp $50 bill. She let it flutter from her gloved fingers, the wind catching it briefly before it landed on the wet, salted pavement directly at Serafina's broken shoes. "Buy a hot meal," Minna commanded, her tone final and devoid of any warmth. "Then get on a bus and leave Chicago. Because if you ever approach my children again, Serafina, Thanos won't be the one you have to worry about. I will handle you myself." Serafina stared in absolute horror at the cold, unyielding strength radiating from Minna's hazel eyes. The poor, frightened maid was dead and buried. The queen of the syndicate had arrived, and she was far more terrifying than Thanos Rossi could ever be. Serafina let out a pathetic whimper, snatched the wet bill from the freezing ground, and practically sprinted down the street, disappearing forever into the city's grey, unforgiving underbelly. Minna watched her go for a moment, before turning on her heel and walking toward the waiting, idling armored SUV. Thanos was sitting in the spacious back seat, having watched the entire exchange through the heavily tinted, bulletproof glass. The interior of the car was incredibly warm, smelling of rich leather and his expensive cologne. As Minna slid in beside him, brushing the lingering cold from her coat, she noticed the proud, deeply predatory smirk playing on his lips. "You handled that beautifully," Thanos murmured, reaching out to pull her close. He pressed a warm, lingering kiss against the side of her neck. "She's a ghost, Thanos. Let her haunt someone else's city," Minna said, exhaling a long breath and leaning gratefully into his solid warmth. Thanos pulled back slightly, his expression turning serious, his striking green eyes locking onto hers. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He didn't produce a velvet box holding a flawless, multi-million-dollar rock designed to blind the paparazzi. Instead, he pulled out a simple, elegant vintage gold band. Set in the center was a single, deeply colored, slightly imperfect sapphire. Minna gasped softly, her hands flying to her mouth. She recognized the ring immediately from the old faded photographs she had dusted in Thanos' study during her first weeks at the estate. "Is that my mother's?" Thanos confirmed, his voice thick with a heavy, profound emotion. He gently took Minna's left hand, pulling off her leather glove. She wore it when my father was just a low-level foot soldier, running numbers on the south side. It survived mob wars, betrayals, and the bloody rise of an empire. It was never meant for a woman who only wanted the crown. He looked deeply into her eyes, the chaotic world outside the armored glass fading away completely, leaving only the two of them in the quiet safety of the car. It belongs on the hand of a woman who knows what real loyalty is, a woman who builds a home instead of a cage. Thanos' thumb traced her knuckles. Marry me, Minna. Not for the press. Not to appease the board. Marry me for the twins. For us. Minna looked down at the deep blue sapphire, then back up at the ruthless, powerful man who had torn down his entire reality just to find her waiting in the wreckage. She smiled, a radiant, tearful, breathtaking smile that completely illuminated the dark interior of the vehicle. Yes, she whispered fiercely, wrapping her arms around his neck. Yes, Thanos. He slipped the vintage gold ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit.